How do we discover what's true? That's what I want to spend this episode looking into. And unlike previous episodes, where I just gave you the truth, told you the truth, or just delivered a bunch of statements to you about how reality is, in this episode, we want to do an exploration, an investigation. We're less interested in the final answers, and we're more interested in the process, the actual reasoning. So this episode, we're doing something a little bit different. I'm just shooting this totally off the cuff, and I want to guide you through a bit of how I do existential inquiry or investigation. I'm not talking about self-inquiry, and if you just want to know what the truth is, go watch my episode, What is Truth?, where I explain all that in detail. Here, this is actually more valuable. I want to take you through the thought process, the logic that goes into questioning reality and life. And really, this is the heart of the work that I do. This is the kind of work that I've been doing since I was 16 years old, like deep philosophical investigation, not by reading books or by grabbing information from other sources, but deriving it simply through your own inquiry, through your own contemplative process, thinking for yourself. I think this will be valuable for many of you because most people don't know that this can be done, and they don't know how to do it because there's no examples of this that are taught to you in school or in university. This is rare stuff. So what we're interested in here is truth. What is truth? How do we find out the truth about reality, about life, the ultimate truth? That's what we're interested in. Why would we be interested in truth? Well, and you might even start the investigation what is truth? What does it even mean to go looking for truth? And why would anybody want to do it? Now, I'm going to be talking a lot here almost as though I'm talking to myself. And that's exactly how it should look. You're going to be talking to yourself throughout this process. So kind of try to do this vicariously through watching me talking to myself and talking to you. We're going to be kind of combining those two together. But this is kind of like how it should go in your own mind. So here I'm going to be posing a lot of questions to myself and also to you, and then sometimes answering them or sometimes not, or sometimes, waffling on them. So there's a difference between me delivering just nuggets of truth to you as a lecturer versus me actually going through the process myself as I sit down and do it for myself. These are very different things. Because when I deliver nuggets of truth to you as like a student, teacher to student sort of situation, then that means I already went through the process myself years ago, and now I'm just regurgitating my conclusions to you. But when I'm going through it myself, this is a dirty process. That means that sometimes I come up with wrong answers, I say silly things, so forth. I make mistakes, I come up with various kinds of examples. Maybe they make sense, maybe they don't, right? It's a much rougher process. Through this process, though, is how you ultimately get to those golden nuggets of insight that then I often share with you guys. So I'm trying to put myself back in that state that I was in when I was 16 years old, and I was really interested in truth, probably the most that I ever was in my life. And I guess what really began my inquiry is that I had an intuitive sense that there must be a truth. There is some way, supposedly, that reality is, right? There must be some ultimate way that reality is. And if the conclusion is that there isn't such a way, then that would be how reality is, you see? So you can't sort of escape there being a truth. There has to be a truth. At least that's sort of how we start this inquiry. There has to be some way that reality is, but we're not sure which way exactly reality is. What is reality? Is reality just a mechanical process? Is it just the Big Bang? Was there something before the Big Bang? Will there be something after the Big Bang? Is there a point to reality? Why does it exist? Where did it come from? Where is it going? How is it? Is there an objective reality, or is reality subjective? What role does the mind play in reality? Is reality independent of the mind? Or is it wholly dependent upon the mind? So these sorts of questions, ultimately, I just wanted to understand what reality is and why it is. And for that, we need truth, of course, because look, if you're going to be searching or trying to understand reality and what you have is not the truth but falsehood, then is that going to satisfy you? Are you going to be satisfied by having a false model of the world? Of course not. You want an accurate model of the world. You want to know reality the way it really is, not your fantasy about it. And of course, if we've studied even a little bit of history, we know that people have had all sorts of crazy models of the world, all sorts of crazy views of how reality is, only later, 100 years later or 1,000 years later, for that to be revealed to be total nonsense and fantasy. So we don't want to end up like those people. For example, maybe the ancient Greeks or Romans or the early Christians had this view that the earth was the center of the universe and that stars and planets, they rotated around the earth in perfect circular orbits. And there was like 7 or 8 of these specific circles. Each circle was larger, like one nested inside the other. So there's this sort of Ptolemaic model of the universe. And thousands, perhaps millions of people believed in this model and thought that that's exactly how reality is. And then, of course, all of that was shattered. And it was shattered not just once. It was shattered over and over and over and over again by various kinds of scientific discoveries. First, the Earth was dethroned from the center of the universe. Then we discovered that the Earth actually moves as well. Not only is it not in the center, but it also moves around, orbits around. Then we discovered that even our sun is not the center of the universe the way we might have assumed. And that is just one out of billions of other suns. And then now there's new discoveries that the universe is expanding. And then there's stuff like dark energy and dark matter that we don't even know really what it is. We've only really come to grips and understand about 5% of all the mass of the universe. The other 95% scientists don't even know what it is. And then what if there are universes beyond our universe? So it just kind of like every century there's new stuff that gets discovered that dethrones old models of the world and sometimes reveals them to be totally wrong. But then we can have even more outlandish questions like, well, what if we're living in a simulation? What if we're living in some kind of matrix? Or what if mankind was created by aliens? Or what if religion is true? What if Christianity is true? What if Islam is true? What if Buddhism is true? How do we know? After all, there are so many different views of what reality is and what we should do about it. Of course, what you think reality is informs how you act, what motivates you, and what you think is right and wrong and what we should do. So there's all these different philosophical systems, religious systems, scientific systems. Which one do you choose? How do you know which one is true? Different teachers teach different things. And it's not like you can just say, well, science is true, obviously, so let's just believe science. But how do you know science is true unless you've done a deep investigation into the foundations of what science is and how science works? And then furthermore, we have to wonder, like, well, even if we say, okay, science is the truest of all of these, which of course is still highly suspect because we haven't really done any investigation yet. We have to determine whether that's true or not. See, we don't know from the outset when we do our inquiry. We have to be very careful not to assume anything here. That's the problem that people make, is they just take for granted that, well, science is obviously correct, or Christianity is obviously true, or whatever. We can't take that for granted. If we really care about finding out how the universe is, we need to be willing to investigate how it actually is. You see? And that means that if the way that it really is contradicts the way that I want it to be, or how I think it is, I need to be willing to admit that I've been wrong, that I have wrong assumptions, or that the way that I want it to be is not how it really is. And that can be a painful admission for me to make, you see. So already what we're discovering here in this inquiry process is that we have to be very careful about being objective and unbiased. And we see that it's very easy to fall into the trap of believing or holding the universe to be a particular way because we want it to be that way. And because that suits us. But of course, we're not really interested in what suits us. We're interested in the way it actually is, if we're serious about truth. See? So like I was saying, though, even if we accept science as the ultimate method of arriving at truth, which science? Which scientists are you going to believe? And in what period of time? Science is not just a simple monolithic thing, like, oh yeah, science. No, I mean, science is comprised of thousands, tens of thousands of different individuals that hold different views and different models of reality. Many of them conflict and disagree. Many of these scientific theories are disproven. In fact, probably the majority of scientific theories are disproven or flaws are found within them. And of course, science advances and changes, so science is different every century, every millennia. So who are you going to believe? It's not so simple, you see. And that's assuming that science actually will lead us to truth. What if science doesn't lead to truth? We have to be also open to that possibility too. See? So already we're starting to see here, just by beginning this little bit of common sense reasoning. And that's all that this inquiry really is. We're just using common sense here, but we're being very objective about it. We're not playing favorites. We're not trying to defend any existing worldview. You see, this is so important. Because if I come up here and I say, well, okay, I'm going to do this inquiry, but of course, it has to come out that Christianity is true. It has to come out that the Bible is correct and it's not contradicted. See, already that's a gross conflict of interest that distorts our inquiry. To do this inquiry properly, we have to be totally neutral and agnostic and indifferent really about the result. Whatever it turns out to be, maybe the truth will turn out to be a beautiful, amazing thing. Maybe it'll turn out to be exactly the way the Christians talk about it. Maybe it won't. Maybe the truth will turn out to be a hellish, terrible thing. Maybe I won't like the truth. Maybe the truth will endanger my survival. Maybe the truth will endanger my career and my children. Maybe the truth will reveal that everything I've been taught in school, in church, in university, in the media is all false. Which brings us to the next important point. In doing this inquiry, we are admitting to ourselves and really denying ourselves reliance on external authority for truth. That is the whole point of this inquiry. And I want to explain a little bit of the logic behind this. Because look, we're going to start from scratch. We're going to start to investigate reality from scratch without assuming anything. If we do that, that means we can't accept any external authority figure's word or hearsay for what the truth is. So maybe there's some charismatic guru who speaks to us in some video on YouTube and tells us what the truth is. But our problem is, how do we know that what he's saying is true? How do we know we can trust that guru? How do we know he's not deceived, deluded, dogmatic, leading a cult, or whatever? Again, because there's millions of gurus and experts out there in the world, professors, academics, scholars, scientists, researchers, mystics, gurus, cult leaders, business people, artists, philosophers, and they've existed since the dawn of civilization for 10,000 years. So which of them are we going to believe? They all say very contradictory things at times. See? So if we really care about the truth, we have to acknowledge that we can't just blindly go accept somebody's word for it. See? We have to take full responsibility here. We have to be our own authority. We have to somehow in this process use common sense and reason, or maybe some other faculty, maybe intuition, maybe experience, maybe consciousness, whatever. Maybe a laboratory testing. You know, there are different methods we could potentially use to get to the truth. And right now, where we start is we start from ground zero, which means that we don't know which methods are valid or not valid. Maybe we'll discover that voodoo is a valid method of arriving towards the truth. See, so we can't be prejudiced when we begin this process. We can't be begging questions. We can't be reasoning in circles. We can't be assuming the thing we're trying to discover. It might seem, for example, to you, the way you were raised, maybe you were raised in a relatively atheistic, scientific, rationalist household where your parents were rather scientific. And maybe the way you were raised with the sort of idea that, ooh, voodoo and witchcraft, these are obviously nonsense. You can't use voodoo and witchcraft to arrive at the truth. Everybody knows that. See, but you got to be careful. If we're really beginning this investigation from scratch, from ground zero, we have to be so careful not to just dismiss something like voodoo or witchcraft. Because again, look, there's a lot of very subtle question begging that goes on here. There's a lot of subtle assumptions and things that are taken for granted. For example, with witchcraft. It might seem like, oh, well, Leah, obviously everybody knows that you can't use witchcraft to get to the truth. Everybody knows science is better. But how do you really know that? Have you done witchcraft to test it? You see, your culture tells you that witchcraft is some sort of hocus pocus nonsense. But remember, we said we can't just blindly trust our culture. We can't trust some authority figure. So if some Harvard professor tells me that witchcraft is bullshit, okay, I can listen to him, I can take his opinion into account, but ultimately I have to decide for myself whether that's true. Because when I'm beginning my investigation from zero, I don't know who to trust. Because, you know, if I ask a witch whether witchcraft is worthwhile and can maybe give me some deep insight into reality, the witch might tell me, yes, let me teach you some witchcraft. Come learn with me. Now, if I ask a college, Harvard professor about that, he'll say, oh, no, witchcraft is all nonsense. Come to Harvard, learn with me. So how do I know who's right? But you see, this is very challenging to distinguish because it requires direct experience of witchcraft and then direct experience of the Harvard way of discovering truth and whatever that might lead to, and then comparing those two carefully and then seeing which one actually weighs out. But see, most people, they're not able to take this neutral investigative stance. Rather, what they do is they just make a knee-jerk assessment like, oh, well, witchcraft is nonsense, I'm going to go to Harvard. Or the opposite, or whatever. Or maybe you just think, oh, well, I'm just going to read the Bible. But you see, why are you placing trust in the Bible? Why are you placing trust in Harvard? Why are you placing trust in witchcraft? If you're honest and you think about it, you realize that, well, it's just because that's what I've been taught. The thing that I prefer, the method of investigation that I prefer is simply that which I grew up in. So if my household was Christian, I'm probably going to gravitate towards the Christian way. If my household was atheist, rationalist, scientific, I'm going to probably end up going to Harvard or some university and trying to get truth that way. Or if I grew up with a bunch of witches in my family, then I'll probably be open to witchcraft. You see, but here's the problem. Just because you were born into a particular household at a particular time in history, in a particular country, into a particular culture, into a particular religion, these are all accidents. These are not guarantors of any kind of truth. What if you were born, like if you think, for example, that Christianity is the right way to discover the truth? Well, just consider, what if you were born a Muslim into a Muslim household? That means that you would just gravitate towards Islam, and then you would believe in Islam and do Islam and convince yourself that Islam is the right way to arrive at truth. And according to your own Christian worldview, the Muslims, they're deluded. So in this case, you would be deluded. Isn't it really suspicious that you just happen to be born just into the perfect household as a Christian? How lucky for you that you were born a Christian into a perfect Christian household, and that Christianity of all the different philosophies is the one true one. See, this should already make you extremely suspicious that you got this fortunate. Because if you are really honest and you look around and you think that, well, there's probably at least over 1,000 different religions, philosophies, and epistemic systems that exist or have existed throughout human history. What are the chances that I will be born into the right one? And there certainly are a lot more deluded ones and false ones than there are true ones. So how do I know that I was born into the right one? Chances are that I wasn't, not that I was. I would have to be very naive and foolish to think that, oh, well, I just got so lucky. I was born into an atheist scientific household that happened to believe in evolution, and therefore, and it just happened that that's all true. No. If we're serious about truth, we have to be much more rigorous. We can't play favorites here. We have to take seriously the possibility that we were born into a background of culture and teachings that might have been false, and those might have been programmed into us from a very early age, to the point where now we have a bias and a sort of a personal preference for that worldview, even though that worldview is very false. See? And so already what we're starting to notice is that there's a very important and inescapable psychological component to the inquiry into truth. Because it's not merely like some might think it like, oh, well, truth is just a purely rational, purely scientific endeavor. We're going to go out there, we're going to run our tests, our lab results, we're going to get objective evidence, we're going to get the facts. We're not going to have any kind of emotional distortions or anything like that, and we're going to grab the facts, we're going to look at them, and we're going to say, okay, here's the fact, here's what it is, and then we're just going to report it, and then we're going to be done. No. Already we can see that it doesn't work this way. Because who's doing the inquiry here? I am, you are, we are. If I'm doing the inquiry, already I can see that my own personal preferences and biases and my own emotional weaknesses are going to be a huge distorting factor. You see? There might be a resistance, an emotional resistance to letting go of old programming and teachings. And we know that human beings are easily psychologically manipulated and brainwashed and indoctrinated. We know this from examples of cults, examples of religion, examples of mass hysteria and delusion that have happened in the past, from Nazism to various kinds of sects and religions that went corrupt. We know this even from science. There were many intelligent scientists who believed in crackpot theories that were crazy. We know this from medicine. There were many doctors throughout history who had all sorts of quack cures that they thought would work, but they actually made the patient's conditions much worse, resulting in death and so forth. We know that businesses can have policies and worldviews that are shaped by their economic agendas and interests, such that they might not speak the truth to us because it's not in their financial interest to do so. For example, you have some giant oil company. Is that giant oil company going to want to do research into climate change, if there is such a thing as climate change? Probably not, because why would it be in their interest to do so? If some giant oil company discovered that the climate is being seriously negatively impacted by their business, are they going to report that? Are they going to be honest about it? You see, you have to become much more savvy about how difficult this truth investigation really is. It's not as simple as going out there and just finding the facts. We have to contend with the fact that our own emotional system, our own psychological weaknesses and preferences and biases all make this process much harder than it first appears. So already what we're discovering here that is, if I am serious about discovering the truth, I have to be very serious about being introspective and conscious of my own biases, preferences, my own psyche, my own fears, my own attachments, and my own worldview. Because it's not like I can start this investigation from ground zero as though I was born yesterday. No. We're starting this investigation when we're 16 years old, 20 years old, 25 years old, 30 years old. Maybe you're 40, maybe you're 50 years old, maybe even older when you begin this investigation. But even if you're very young, like I was, I began this when I was probably 16. You might say, oh, that's so young. But that's 16 years of programming that I got before I was starting to reason it out for myself. See? By that point, I had almost finished my entire schooling. That's 12 years of being indoctrinated with all sorts of belief systems from society about what's true and what's false. How do I know that those were actually true and not false? See? So now I have to be very careful about my own expectations. What do I expect the truth to look like? What do I want it to be? What am I attached to already? Because it's not like I'm just a blank slate and I'm indifferent to what the outcome of this investigation is. No, I have ideas. I have my best guesses. I have my own theories about what the truth is. And these theories now skew the investigation because I only have so much time. I only have so much mental energy. And the world and the universe is a vast thing. And there's, let's say, thousands of different philosophies and worldviews out there. I can't possibly explore them all. And even if I could, I would have to have some sort of prioritization system. I'd have to begin somewhere. For example, if I have to test 10 different philosophies between Christianity, Islam, atheism, science, and witchcraft, and something else, if I have to test all those, where do I begin? I'm probably going to begin with the one I think is most likely to be true, right? Because if I just start testing them at random and I start testing a bunch of false ones, there's probably a lot more false ones than are true ones. I could spend the next 50 years of my life investigating false philosophies and get nowhere. And in fact, I could get indoctrinated into some of those and fool myself that I've made progress when actually I didn't. But you see, already the problem is, how do you decide which one to start investigating first? You might think that, well, science is clearly the best option to start with first. But is it? How do you know that? Where did that idea come from? Did it come from you? Did it come from your own line of inquiry and reasoning? Or did it come from culture? See, if you're honest here, and again, this requires self-awareness and self-honesty, two very important qualities in this work. You have to admit that, well, my preference for science probably is the result of cultural conditioning that I got because I grew up in this sort of scientific society or a scientific culture or a scientific household, or I went to a scientific school where they programmed me with this idea that science is the best. See? And we have to be suspicious of that. We can't take that for granted because here's the bottom line. If we really want to question from scratch, and that's what we're trying to, that's our ideal that we're shooting for. We're trying to question as much from scratch as possible without any external influences. Because why? These external influences can be corrupting, and we want to find the truth for ourselves. Why? Well, because supposedly if something is true, it must be true independent of somebody else telling it to me, right? Otherwise, what use could the truth have? If the truth is true simply because some Harvard professor told it to me, then it isn't worth very much. The whole point of the truth, supposedly, and this is still something we need to verify, but, to get this investigation off the ground, we do have to make some assumptions. We can't just make no assumptions, because assumptions are how we get ourselves bootstrapped. But, we have to be careful about the assumptions we make. But I think it's safe to make at least this assumption for now, that truth has to be independent from human beings, from what human beings tell us. Which means that if the truth can be written down in a book, that's well and good. Perhaps that's possible to write it down in a book. But also maybe it's not possible. But let's say it's possible. The truth can't depend on the book itself. Rather, the book itself has to depend on the truth. You see? Which means that if other human beings could discover the truth, because of course a book is written by a human being, so supposedly how did that human being who wrote the book, which supposedly contains the truth, how did that human being find it out? There's only one of two ways, either from another human being or from the truth itself, directly, somehow, whatever that means. If he found it out from some other human being, well, we're just pushing the problem back one level. And so again, we can ask, well, if he learned it from his master or from his teacher, okay, fine. But then how did that master or teacher get it? Again, one of two options, either from some other master or teacher or from the truth itself. So let's say we push this back 100 steps. Let's say there's a chain of 100 people who learned from 100 other people what the truth is. But we want to go back to the very first person who learned it. How did he learn it? The first person, he didn't have books. He didn't have other teachers. There had to be at least one point in human history where somebody discovered the truth for him or herself and then wrote it down or then taught it. You see? Otherwise, what are you teaching and writing down? You're just making something up. You see? So that's sort of one of the interesting characteristics of truth, is that, and that's one of its values, is that it's external to human activity. And perhaps we could, here's sort of the longer vision, if we could discover the truth, perhaps we could ground ourselves in the truth rather than always navigating by human constructions. Because, books are human constructions. Universities are human constructions. Even science is a human construction. Religions are human constructions. If there is truth in any of those, books, experts, masters, religions, science, universities, it has to be grounded in something outside of all that, prior to all that. See? Or maybe not. We have to be open to that possibility as well. See, now we got to talk a little bit about assumptions. We're going to be making assumptions to bootstrap our inquiry process. We just have to, otherwise we can't move at all. But we have to be very careful about the assumptions we make, because at every assumption we make, recognize we don't really know if it's true or not. It might seem reasonable, it might seem plausible, it might seem likely, it might seem obvious. But again, how do we know what's obvious? How do we know what's reasonable? How do we know what's likely? Again, notice that we're judging that based on the cultural background that we're in, the century we're living in, the country we're living in, the religion that we're a part of as a culture, by the technology that we have, which limits our ability to investigate and to explore more of the universe. So we have to be very careful. If we do make an assumption, we have to make a mental note, or even better, write it down on a piece of paper, that we made an assumption here. We're going to keep doing our inquiry just to get ourselves going, but we have to remember to come back at some point and re-question that assumption. Because the assumptions we make very early on, they can have a significant effect on how far we diverge into some wrong direction. Because every wrong assumption we make at the very beginning, you see, we build on top of that. It's almost like building a skyscraper. If you get the first floor of the skyscraper totally wrong, the 100th floor is going to be way, way wrong. You probably aren't even going to be able to get to a 100th floor if you don't make sure your first 50 floors are really straight and accurate. So you see how challenging this is becoming. We began here with such an innocent question. And it seems so simple. And now look at all these complexities that are arising. Our mind is being pulled in 100 different directions. We don't know which way to go. That's right. That's why this is so challenging. This is why so few people do this inquiry. But we're determined and we're eager and we're passionate about the truth. So we're going to keep going. And we're not going to take anything for granted. We're not even going to take reason or logic for granted. You might say, well, we're just going to be reasonable and we're going to use reason to get to the truth. But we have to wonder, how do we know that reason leads to the truth? You might say, oh, well, of course, it's obvious. It's obvious. Everybody knows that reason leads to the truth. How do you know that? Where did you get that idea? Did you derive that idea for yourself? Did you prove it to be correct and true? Or are you just assuming it and you just got it from your culture and you're taking it for granted that that's the case? Are you just agreeing with that because everybody around you agrees with it? You see, there's enormous peer pressure here. It's not like we're just doing this inquiry by ourselves, like we're some lone individual living on top of a mountaintop without friends or social connections or contacts. We don't listen to the news. We don't watch TV. We don't read the newspapers. Like, we're completely isolated and all alone. If that's how humans lived, then this process might be a lot easier. But we live in a herd. We live in giant herds of millions of people. We live in giant cities. We go to clubs and schools and churches and we listen to media. All this feeds into our mind and programs us with ideas. Many of these ideas have been proven throughout history to be wrong. So it's quite likely that many of them are still wrong. Also consider the possibility that, of course, the media and school and society and business might not be interested in the truth. Their agenda might have nothing to do with the truth. Maybe they're more interested in money or sex or survival or promoting their ideology. Maybe Christianity is more interested in the survival of Christianity than it is in truth. Science too. Maybe science is more interested in the perpetuation of science rather than in discovering the truth. These are all possibilities we have to take seriously, because we're admitting the most fundamental thing we're admitting when we begin this inquiry is that we don't know. This is where it all begins. You have to honestly admit that you don't know what the truth is. It's not enough to fake it and to say, well, yeah, okay, Leo, I don't know what it is, but it's probably science. Like, in the back of your mind, you're like, probably science. It's going to be in the direction of science. No, if you think that way, then you haven't really admitted that you don't know. You have to really, like, right now, I want you to get right now, try to get this in your direct experience, that if you're truly honest, you don't really know what reality is, why it's here, and what it's doing. Isn't that true? Couldn't we start with that little nugget of truth right there, that we don't know? We just don't know. When we begin this inquiry, we don't even know if reason will deliver us the truth. Because look, what would it take to know for sure that reason will deliver us the truth? We would have to actually go and do a lot of reasoning and verify that every bit of reasoning that we do leads to truth and never leads to falsehood. And if even one bit of reasoning is discovered that happens to lead to falsehood, already that undermines the entire premise that reason can lead to truth. You see? You see how tricky this is? So if I can find one case in human history where some human used reason to lead to a false worldview, that's it. Reason is no longer reliable. We have to be skeptical about reason. And of course, you can find a million such cases. People just assume that reason leads to truth. No, it doesn't. More often than not, reason leads to delusion and falsehood. It's very easy for the mind to rationalize whatever worldview it believes in already. See? This is called begging the question. There are so many outlandish examples of this that an entire book can be written just about example after example after example of foolish reasoning. Now you say, aha, Leo, yeah, of course reason can be misused. Of course, there have been many examples of foolish reasoning in the past. But, Leo, what I'm talking about is not foolish reasoning, but correct reasoning. But you see, this brings us right back to the very beginning. How do you distinguish correct reasoning from foolish reasoning? That's the very problem that we began with, because this is the question of truth. What you're really saying when you're saying, well, there's foolish reasoning and then there's correct reasoning, is you're saying, well, there's falsehood and then there's truth. Right. That's sort of where we began. There's supposedly falsehood in the world and there's truth in the world. How do we discover the truth? So what you're really saying is that, well, Leo, I'll discover the truth through some truthful method. Okay, but how do you know which method is truthful? You're back to square one. See? How do you know that the truthful method or the true correct reason that you're using is actually true and correct? You can't just take that for granted, because there have been numerous examples of people throughout history who have justified their crazy worldviews under the pretense that it's true and reasonable. These days, many atheistically minded, scientifically, rationally minded people tend to sort of assume that reason leads to truth, and because it's a part of science, they tend to lump together science and reason, and that religion and witchcraft and all that's all the unreasonable stuff. No, this is just historically incorrect. If you look at human history and what humans have believed, and you don't have to be some brilliant historian to know this, just a bit of high school history will suffice. Religious people have always considered themselves to be reasonable people. A religious person doesn't believe that he's unreasonable. From his point of view, his worldview is very reasonable and consistent. He doesn't think himself of a fool or an idiot or some wishy-washy, hocus-pocus type of person. He thinks that his Christianity or his Islam or whatever, that is the truth. And he thinks he arrived at it through a truthful, reasonable process. He believes in God, for example, and he thinks that it's highly unreasonable to disbelieve God. He will create logical arguments for why God must exist. And it's not like only idiots and fools believe in God or in religion, because many of our most intelligent humans of all time have believed in God and subscribed to various kinds of religions. So you can't just simplistically dismiss all of that. After all, what if they're right? How do you know that they're wrong? Did you actually go and deeply study and personally investigate what they believed to verify, to test whether it was right or wrong? Or are you just assuming because, your culture tells you that, oh, Christians, they're deluded, and you're just accepting that? See? It's very, very tricky. You have to really press your own feet to the fire here and not take anything for granted. You have to really question all of these cultural assumptions that have been given to you based on whatever culture you grew up in. You have to be very, very suspicious of all those. So that's what we're doing. Or maybe science is the best method. I don't know. How do you know? Have you tested it? How much science have you actually done? This will freak you out, especially if you're a big fan of science and you fancy yourself a rationalist, and you don't like the dogma of religion. Well, okay, the dogma of religion seems to have resulted in a lot of problems in the past, but what about science? What about the dogma of science? How much science have you actually done? Be honest. I don't mean how much you've read in high school. I don't mean how many Scantron tests you filled out or how many lectures you've listened to and taken notes on. That isn't really science. That is all hearsay. That is supposedly other scientists passing on their discoveries to you. And not even that, because you weren't taught science by real scientists. You were taught scientists by non-scientists. You see, because your high school chemistry teacher, she didn't actually do any science when she taught you chemistry. She just taught from a book that was given to her. So she wasn't a scientist, most likely. See? So how do you know? You are literally trusting the authority of those textbooks and those teachers who passed it on from others and others and others and others and others. Science is a highly social, hierarchical, bureaucratic system. Really not much different than religion. Because if you're a Christian and you believe in God and Christ and all this, how do you know? How do you even know there was a Christ? And see, right here we reach an interesting point, because if you're a Christian and you want to do a serious inquiry into truth, and you're not willing to open your mind to the possibility that Christ didn't even exist, you've already failed. Already failed. Why? Because you've completely given away your authority and responsibility for discovering the truth to some other human. You see? Notice the following point. The only thing you know about Christ, you learned from other humans. Because, of course, you have no direct experience of Christ. The only reason you know about Christ is because other humans existed who told you about it. And you blindly believed them and assumed that they were telling you correctly. But there are interesting possibilities here, like that those people could have been deluded, could have been lying to you, could have been mistaken, just honestly mistaken. Because how did your parents learn about Christ? Obviously, they didn't meet Christ. So they learned it from their parents. And how did their parents learn it? Well, from their parents. And now, how far do we have to go back? Well, we have to go back like 100 generations or so. That's a lot of generations. That's a lot of hearsay. A chain of 100 hearsays over 2,000 years, and you're going to trust that? Wow, you're very gullible. You must really have a high faith in humanity to believe that. See? Now, I'm not particularly saying here that Christ never existed. All I'm saying is that I want you to notice in yourself, if you're a Christian and you cannot open your mind to the serious possibility that Christ never actually existed, you're done. You're fucked. You've already failed this process. Your mind needs to be open enough to be open to literally any possibility. And this brings us to the key point of existential investigation is open-mindedness, radical open-mindedness. I stress this point a lot, but people still don't understand the significance of this. You will only appreciate what radical open-mindedness is when you begin this investigation into the truth. And when you reach a point where you realize that, holy shit, I don't know anything. And I can't rely whatsoever on any external human source or any hearsay to help me in this investigation, which means I have to derive it all for myself, which means I have to be completely objective and I have to be completely impartial. And if I'm completely honest and completely impartial, I admit that I don't know anything. That means I have to be open to absolutely every possibility being true. Because you see, if I tell you that the universe was created by a space kangaroo, and you say, oh, well, Leo, that's horseshit. That can't possibly be real. You've already failed in this work. You've closed your mind. See? Because when you admit that I don't know, what that really means, and there's so many layers of depth to this I don't know. We've only scratched the surface of it. What it really means is that you don't fucking know. It means you cannot assign probabilities to what the truth might be. You might say, well, Leo, the probability, yeah, maybe I'll allow a 1% chance that the universe was created by a giant space kangaroo. Because it seems kind of far-fetched. You've already failed. You've already failed. You can't do that. You can't assign probabilities because to be able to assign a probability to an outcome means that you already are assuming that you know what's true. Because what are your probabilities based on? You're begging the question. You don't know what's true. You don't know what's far-fetched or not. You don't know what's possible or not. You see how deep this goes? Because your ideas of what's possible or what's probable or what's likely or what's far-fetched or not or what's weird or what's crazy or what's impossible, all of these ideas are completely derived from your culture. Maybe also a little bit from your direct experience. Because, in your direct experience, to be honest, you've never seen a space kangaroo, so you might say that, well, the probability of there being a space kangaroo is quite low because I've never seen one. Okay, well, fine, but that's very poor logic because there's a lot of stuff you haven't seen. You've never seen $1 billion. Doesn't mean that it ain't out there. You've probably never seen Jupiter. Doesn't mean it ain't out there. There's a lot of stuff you believe very firmly that you've never seen. And after all, your view on reality is so narrow. Obviously, it's so narrow. You've seen so little of reality. You've seen so little. I'm not even talking about other planets. You've seen so little of planet Earth. You've seen so few cities. How many cities on this planet have you been to? A dozen? A couple dozen, probably at most? Maybe 100? There's hundreds of thousands of cities on this planet, most of them you've never been to, yet you assume they exist there. And of course, there's most of reality, 99.99999% of reality you haven't seen. So what does that tell us? That tells us that you're clueless. It tells us that there's so much stuff out there that could surprise you. You have to be open to surprise. That's a very important aspect of this open-mindedness deal that we're talking about. To be open-minded is to admit that I don't really know, and my assignment of probabilities to outcomes are really ultimately groundless if I want to be honest about it. And so I have to be even open to things that might seem crazy or absurd, like giant space kangaroos creating the universe. It's a little counterintuitive and tricky here because you might think like, well, Leo, but if I open my mind to all sorts of crazy possibilities like giant space kangaroos and stuff like that, what's to stop me from getting totally deluded? It seems like, Leo, you're actually opening Pandora's box here to all forms of delusion. Shouldn't I be more grounded? Shouldn't I be more rational and more scientific and more conservative in this process? Like, I shouldn't open my mind to all these crazy possibilities. But that's exactly wrong. You would think that opening your mind to a giant space kangaroo would lead you away from truth. But actually, it's the opposite. Because to be conservative and to be very strict with what you allow in your inquiry assumes that you already know the truth. Because how are you disallowing something from your inquiry? Think about that. So, for example, I tell you about the giant space kangaroo, and you say, no, Leo, I'm not even going to think about that. I refuse to read books about giant space kangaroos because they aren't real. How do you know that? Have you searched the entire universe for space kangaroos and come up short? If you have, okay, you're on solid ground, but you haven't. You haven't. You haven't even searched this planet for space kangaroo. Maybe there's a space kangaroo living under your bed. You haven't even searched there. You don't know. It's very important to recognize here that we cannot prejudge our inquiry. We cannot assume what the conclusion might be. We have to actually do the search. We have to go through a discovery process. We can't just say, oh, well, there's probably no space kangaroo under my bed. No, we have to actually look under our bed for the space kangaroo. In fact, if you want to take this process seriously, go pause this video right now and go look under your bed for a space kangaroo. That will be the first bit of existential inquiry that you've probably done in your whole life. Go look under your bed. You probably won't find one there, but hey, at least you're doing the work now. And you're understanding a little bit of what it takes. Now, here already we're running into one of the chief problems and objections that people have. One of the chief obstacles to this inquiry is that people say, oh, well, Leo, but this is becoming so hard. I thought this was just going to be some fun armchair philosophy where I get to sit around and I just get to think about stuff like whether I'm in a matrix or not, or I get to come up with cool ideas and I get to, play around with my pet theories and rationalize my own belief system. And now you're telling me I got to go check under my bed? I got to go and do this. This is hard work. I got to bend my back. I got to peek under there. I got to grab the flashlight if it's real dark under there, check to see, and after all, Leo, how many beds do I have to check? I mean, if I check this one bed, but there's a million beds on this planet, do I have to check under every bed for these space kangaroos? This is going to waste my whole life. It's too much work. It's too much expense. Why am I doing all this? Let me just go back to living my ordinary life. That's exactly the reasoning that people use to not do this work. And you can't really blame them because when we begin this inquiry, we have no idea whether it'll be worthwhile or not. Maybe we're going to spend the next 100 years checking every bed on the planet for giant space kangaroos, and we'll find nothing. And we will have wasted all of that life. And we could have used those 100 years to have sex, to buy houses, to do drugs, to watch TV, to travel around the world, and to drink champagne and drive fast cars and yachts, and build businesses and all this, and make children and raise families and all this. And we will have sacrificed all of that just to find nothing. Yeah, that's right. That's the cost of finding truth. So, if you don't care about the truth, if you don't care about knowing how reality actually is, remember, that's what we're really interested in, how reality actually is. If you don't care to know that, then you're done. You'll never discover the truth. Now you might wonder, well, Leo, but what if it's not even possible in theory to discover the truth? What if there is no truth to discover? What if all this is just mental masturbation? Yeah, that's possible. But also notice, if that's true, then that is the truth. But you don't know that that's true. To know that that's true, you would actually have to go and exhaust every possible avenue of inquiry. Look under every bed, on every planet, in every solar system for space kangaroos, and find nothing. And after all of that, you would discover that, okay, maybe you'd finally, after you've exhausted searching the entire universe, maybe you'd come to the conclusion that, okay, it's not ever possible to reach the truth. And that would be the truth that you'd reach. But it would take you 1 trillion years to search the entire universe. Or maybe there's a faster way. Maybe you can stumble upon some way to get to the truth that will deliver it to you within a year, or within a month, or within a week, or within a day. You don't know. How would you know? If you already knew that, you wouldn't need to begin the inquiry. You see, our undertaking the inquiry has to admit and acknowledge that we don't know. It could be a giant waste of time. Or maybe finding the truth will be the most remarkable, life-changing, life-transforming experience of all time. Maybe it'll result in an orgasm of ecstasy and $100 bills will shower from the sky. Maybe. Maybe it'll make you immortal. Maybe you will become a god who can control the whole universe. Maybe. I mean, sounds kind of far-fetched. But who knows? We don't know, because we haven't finished our work. We've barely begun our work, and yet we've already spent an hour talking about it. See? And that's, of course, with the benefit of me having spent literally thousands of hours doing this on my own. So now I'm kind of guiding you through this process, and it actually kind of seems kind of reasonable and pretty efficient the way I'm explaining it to you now. It only took an hour to get this far. This hour that we just spent together talking about this probably took me thousands of hours to get this far on my own when I began, when I was 16 years old. So of course, I'm guiding you now with the benefit of hindsight, having discovered the truth, and I'll spoil it for you. I did discover it, and it is possible to discover. Spoiler. So of course, the only reason we're talking about it is because it is worthwhile. But you have to understand that that is only my point of view now that I've done the work. When I began the work, I had no idea that it was possible. Which shows you how much commitment you have to have to this process. Because when you begin this work, if you're truly doing this work and you start from a position of I don't know, you don't know if it's going to be possible or worthwhile. Now, here's your problem, is that what I know is not what you know. So even though I've discovered the truth, that doesn't help you at all. Because even if I tell you the truth, how do you know I'm not lying to you? How do you know I'm not deluded? How do you know that you should listen to me? You don't. You see, because from your point of view, I am just another authority figure, which we already talked about and said that we can't listen to. See, so in this process, you're all on your own. I can guide you, I can help you, but you're going to have to do this reasoning for yourself. I can't do it for you. That's one of the tricks with truth, is that the truth must be discovered by every individual for him or herself. That's what makes truth difficult. You can't be lazy here and just expect somebody to deliver the truth to you on a silver platter. Your teacher, your professor, your rabbi, or some book cannot deliver you the truth. It delivers you hearsay. It delivers you opinions, perspectives, and beliefs. But that is not the truth. Or rather, the problem is that you don't know how to differentiate between one belief, one opinion, one perspective over another. To distinguish them, you would need to know the truth first. See, the mistake that people make is they start to distinguish between different belief systems and perspectives and worldviews and opinions, yet they've never discovered the truth. So all they're distinguishing is predicated upon assumptions which are mostly false. But they are not conscious enough to realize this. They think what they're doing when they're judging different opinions and worldviews, they think that they're being truthful, and they think that they are doing this inquiry. They're not doing this inquiry. They are begging the question. They are using past assumptions to adjudicate future situations, but their past assumptions, they never actually validated those. They just picked them up from their culture. That's what distinguishes what most people do from what we're doing here right now, from existential inquiry. It's a huge difference. What most people do is conformity. They conform to the belief system and worldview and perspective of their culture. That's what 99.9% of people are doing, including scientists, intellectuals, academics, Nobel Prize winners, and all that. And then a very, very tiny percentage, less than 1% of people, are doing what we're doing here, which is they're actually thinking for themselves through this stuff. So we've sort of set this situation up. That was good. Now, where do we go from here? Well, we have to wonder, what are the different methods that we might use for discovering truth? Let's brainstorm some possibilities. Well, we could use reason. We have the reasoning faculty. In fact, we've been using it already. Just to get this inquiry off the ground, we've had to use some reason and some very basic common sense. Not any kind of formal logic, but, just basic common sense. We also have had to rely on history, because notice I've brought in examples of history. That was important because we do look to the history of the human race to see where mistakes were made. That's very helpful. But of course, remember, history is very problematic because, again, how do you know anything that you learned about history is actually true? Because history is all hearsay, secondhand accounts. So you have no direct experience of most of the history that you know. But, we'll give that some benefit of the doubt for now. We'll allow some history for now. Of course, we'll have to question it in the future. So we have reason, we have history. We could read books, but again, reading books, how do you know which book is correct? There are so many contradictory books. You could read a book on science, you could read the Bible, you could read the Quran. Which one is correct? How do you know? You have intuition. That's an interesting faculty and vehicle towards truth. Throughout your life, you've used intuition. You've used gut feelings. And sometimes your intuition has panned out and delivered some truthfulness or some accuracy to you, helped you to make decisions in the right way or help you to avoid danger. Maybe you're walking through the forest and you have an intuition that there's a bear around the corner, and what do you know? You spot the bear before he spots you, and then you run away and you're safe. Whereas if you didn't, he would have eaten you. That's valid. So we have intuition, and humans have talked about intuition for since the dawn of civilization. So we might assume that there's something to intuition. We might use science. Now, of course, science is a very complicated thing. We just say the word science, but that drags in with it the entire history of science and all the different methodologies of science. So there's so many methods there. What counts as legitimate science? Does looking through a microscope count? Does looking through a telescope count? Does using sort of particle collider count? Does my direct experience count as science? What is science really? Now, that's an extremely deep question, which we can't go into here. I'll have separate episodes about how science really works and what it is in the future. So that's a long tangent. But okay, we got science that we could potentially use. Maybe we can do some sort of laboratory experiments. Maybe we can get some rats, throw them in a maze, and maybe we can discover some truth by observing rats. Maybe. Or maybe we can do sort of the Jane Goodall approach where we go into the jungle and we live with the chimpanzees and we hide in the bushes and we peek through the bushes using some binoculars and we observe the chimpanzees doing their chimp stuff, and then maybe we learn some truth from them. Maybe. Or maybe we send out satellites into space and we photograph things and we can learn the truth that way through photography. Maybe. Maybe we mix some chemicals in a jar, in a beaker, we stir it around, and then we find some truth through some sort of chemical laboratory testing. Maybe. Maybe we do sociological sort of studies where we get a bunch of group of people together. We get like 100 people on a college campus together, and we run some clever experiments on them. We give them some placebo drug or whatever, and then we test them. We do a control group. We do another group that we give the real drug to. We test them. Then we find the truth through that process. Maybe. How about witchcraft? How about voodoo? How about astral projection? How about psychedelics? How about meditation? How about contemplation? All of these are potential avenues of truth, but we don't know how reliable they are. And of course, the problem is that if we ask somebody, well, okay, so which method should I use? Which method is reliable? You see the problem? We're back to square one. We can't ask that question because if we're going to ask somebody, who are you going to ask? Depending on who you ask, you'll get a different answer. So how do you know who to ask and which answers are correct and which people to trust and not trust? You don't. The only way you could know that is if you already knew the truth. So if you go and ask your college professor whether voodoo is legitimate, he'll tell you no. But can you trust that? Isn't he biased? After all, he works in a university. He spent his whole life in a university. He's been indoctrinated in schools since he was a baby. His parents were probably scientists and professors and so forth. So can you really trust him? Maybe, maybe not. You don't know. How about direct experience? Can you trust your own direct experience? Can you trust perceptions? Maybe perception and direct experience and our awareness of the present moment can lead us to the truth. Now, that's a rather interesting and unique case, direct experience. And by direct experience, I just mean literally the perceptions you're experiencing right now. After all, how do you know you're alive? And that's a good tack to take here when we're investigating reality at the most fundamental level. We can try to ask the question of like, okay, of all the things that I think I know about the world, what do I think I know which is the most unquestionable? Is something that's so basic, so fundamental, so unquestionable that if this thing was wrong, nothing else would matter and nothing more could be done. And so if you think about that for a moment, you might conclude that the one thing that you know for sure is that you exist right now, that you're alive right now. Isn't that true? Is there anything more certain than that you're alive right now? How do you know that you're alive right now? How are you certain of that? Is that something I told you? Is that something you read in a book? Is that something your college professor told you? Is that something your parents taught you? Is that something you read in the Bible or learned at church, that you're alive? Or is there something more primordial and fundamental that makes you aware of your aliveness? Something that is non-human, a non-human source for your aliveness. What is that source? Well, we might call that direct experience. Because after all, notice that if you weren't alive right now, there could be no church, there could be no Bible, there could be no professor, there could be no university, there could be no humans, there could be no planet, there could be no universe, there could be no teaching, there could be no concept of truth, there could be no thoughts, there could be no intuitions, there could be no voodoo, no witchcraft, no science, no reason, no rationality. Nothing. Think this through with me. Don't just accept what I'm saying. Check for yourself whether what I'm saying makes sense and is true. So it seems already we've made some pretty good progress. It seems like we've found something more fundamental than witchcraft and science and universities and churches and Bibles. We've found that it seems like, if you think throughout all of your life, what's the one thing that you've always had with you throughout all that? Because, sometimes you were at church, but other times you weren't. Sometimes you were doing science, but other times you weren't. Sometimes you were using your reason, and other times you weren't. But what's the one thing you always had throughout your whole life? The sense that you're alive. We might almost jump to the conclusion that reality is nothing but your sense of being alive. And then everything else just details. Everything else is just what happens within that frame. But then that raises interesting questions like, well, so does this mean that there's nothing outside of my own life? Are other humans real? Because after all, if I'm dead, they don't exist. Before I was born, there were no humans, from my point of view. So is my point of view all of reality? Or is reality something beyond merely my own point of view and my own little life? Interesting. I don't know. We don't know. Not yet. But there's some interesting possibilities here. Some of these possibilities might seem outlandish and far-fetched, like that space kangaroo. But remember, we don't know. We don't really know. Could it be that I'm the only thing alive in the whole universe? Could it be that the entire universe is just what's happening in my life right now? After all, that has been literally how it's felt since my birth. After all, it does feel, from my point of view, that the entire universe revolves around me. So it's not an unreasonable possibility. Do we know that there's something external to this life? Do we know that there's objects outside of direct experience? If what we're calling here is direct experience, do we know that? Maybe we assume it. Maybe our culture tells us that there is, but how do we know? Maybe there's nothing but this direct experience right now. And in fact, how do I know that the memories I have of my childhood, that those are actually not just something that's happening right now in this present moment? Did those memories of childhood actually happen? Or are they just something I'm imagining right now? Is there even a difference? I don't know. We'll have to investigate all that. Now, there's an additional doubt here that we have to throw in, which is, well, sure, we have perceptions, colors, sounds, and so forth. But after all, perceptions, what are perceptions? Aren't perceptions just a byproduct of evolution and the human physiology? We know that rattlesnakes perceive differently. They can sense infrared when humans can't. We know that other creatures see different colors. Some creatures only see in black and white. Some creatures have entirely new senses of smell or even senses that humans don't even have beyond our five senses. So we can kind of surmise, it's a pretty safe assumption at this point to notice that probably other organisms experience reality in a very different way. Some of them might not even see colors. So how do we know that if we're going to say that direct experience is the only, or not the only, but is like the most fundamental avenue towards truth, which it seems so far that's sort of been our conclusion, but we don't know that. It's still shaky, right? We're not jumping to conclusions here. But it seems like our sense of aliveness comes before religion and before science and before reason, because we first have to be alive in order to get those things. And after all, for me to have science, for me to do reason, for me to have religion, I have to experience them. How do I interface with science at all? How do I interface with rationality? It's through direct experience. Notice that if I eliminate all of my direct experiences, science flies out the window. There can't be science without direct experience. There can't be religion. I can't read the Bible unless I'm experiencing a Bible. I can't know about Christ unless I have an image of Christ in my mind and the word Christ, which all of it is direct experience. So seems like direct experience is pretty fundamental. But there is an additional doubt. This is a classical doubt that philosophers have had since the ancient Greeks and Romans, and probably even before that, which is that how do we know we can trust our perceptions? After all, perceptions seem quite illusory. You can poke your eyeball and you're going to start to see weird colors that weren't there before. You can cross your eyes and then you're actually going to start to see double of certain objects. You can be in a desert, you can see a mirage. You can be underwater or you can be looking through a different colored lens and you're going to see the world colored or shaped in a different way. You can have lenses, camera lenses with different fields of view. You can have fisheye effects and you can have very tight focuses, which result in very flat images. So which of those represents the correct way to look at the world? Do we really want to say that colors, sounds, feelings, and emotions are the most truthful thing we have? Is that what we really want to say? Because after all, the sense of being alive, what is that but a feeling? It seems like so far we've reduced it all down to a feeling. We're saying that a feeling is more fundamental and true than science. Is that true? And how would we check that? You see, it's one thing to just sit around and speculate, but we're not interested here in speculation. We're not interested in probabilities. We're not interested in I think that there's a 65% chance that my perceptions are accurate. No. This does nothing for us. We want truth for certain. It has to be certain. It can't be a probability. It can't be a wild guess or a feeling or a speculation that we have it feels like this is right. No. If there is a truth and we're going to find it, we need to be sure about it. But how do we know that the thing we're sure about is actually the truth and not just something that's a falsehood that we've convinced ourselves is the truth. These are all very thorny questions. It almost seems hopeless. How do we figure this out? We want to turn to somebody for help, but we can't. We want to ask a professor? We can't. We want to read a book? We can't. We want to talk to some rabbi or priest or guru? Nope, can't do it. Can't help us. Because for us to trust them, we'd already need to have the truth. We want to ask ourselves. And we can't do that either. See? Are you going to ask yourself what the truth is? But that already assumes you know what the truth is. So why would you even ask if you already knew? The fact that you're asking already demonstrates that you don't know. So you can't even ask yourself. So it seems impossible. How are you going to figure this out? Yep. That's why so few people do the work, because it seems hopeless. You don't even know how to begin. And yet, I'm going to spoil it for you here, it is possible. How? Well, you keep questioning. You keep investigating. Direct experience turns out to be a very good lead. Follow up on that lead. Keep digging into it. Try to find what's most fundamental in your life. But you can become very, very skeptical with this whole process. You can even question something like your sense of being alive. You can say, well, Leo, but the sense of being alive, what is this? It's just a feeling? Could it be that we're not really alive? What if it's an illusion? What if we think we're alive, but we're really not? What if we're like in a computer simulation? After all, how do we know what it feels like to be alive? Maybe my mind is tricking me. Maybe the way the brain is wired, it does some tricky stuff and it creates the illusion of a human being alive, but really, it's nothing but atoms and molecules. Maybe. How would we sort that out? You see the very deep problem here? What criterion are you going to use to adjudicate different cases of truth versus falsehood? So any case I bring forth to you, how are you going to adjudicate it? Based on what? Any criterion you use will itself be in doubt and require a further criterion. So if I come to you with the question of what's more reliable, your reason or your perceptions? How are you going to decide that? Based on what? Are you going to use reason to adjudicate between reason and perception? That can't work because that's already biased. You're begging the question. The point is that you don't know whether reason or perception is more accurate. So if you're going to use reason to adjudicate between the two, you're already assuming that reason is more accurate, and therefore the point is moot. You've begged the question. You might as well save your time and not even answer it, because your action already reveals your underlying bias. But if you're going to use perception to adjudicate between perception and reason, then you're biased in the other direction, and you're begging the question. So how could this possibly work? It seems like an impossible puzzle. What are you going to use? What can you rely on? There's no firm ground to stand on. Everything is called into question. But there's an even deeper wrinkle to the skepticism. So skepticism is a funny thing. When I started this whole process back when I was 16 years old, I went down this very road that I'm sharing with you now. And of all the different philosophies that I've read, I just went online. This was in the early 2000s when the internet was first born, and there was still very little content compared to today. There was no YouTube, there was barely a Wikipedia and so forth, but there was some semblance of a Wikipedia. And so I think I went on Wikipedia or some website similar to that. It was a philosophy website which just had a bunch of different philosophies. They had materialism, realism, idealism, and dualism, and mysticism, and solipsism, and blah blah blah. It was a catalog of like every different philosophical school. I read through some of them, not all of them. There's too many, and I sort of was thinking about, okay, so which one of these? How do I decide which one's true, and which one do I choose for myself, at least temporarily, if not permanently? And what I resonated the most with was skepticism, the ancient Greek sort. And I considered myself a skeptic at that point. I started to question science by that point so much, and I was into science. I spent a good chunk of my high school education went into science. I took hard science classes, chemistry and advanced physics and advanced biology and all this sort of stuff. I was fascinated in science. I read Darwin's On the Origin of Species just by myself, not as part of a school assignment, because I was fascinated by evolution. I toyed around with the idea of becoming a molecular biologist. I entered university studying aerospace engineering. So I was very scientifically minded. Most of my college classes were hardcore calculus classes, physics classes, mechanics classes, like pretty dry, boring stuff. I kind of regret it in retrospect, but yeah, it wasn't very fun. It was kind of dry and boring. But I was serious about that stuff, and I was interested in it. But also, I started questioning so deeply that I realized that I can't take science for granted as true. So at that point in my investigation, I literally placed science at the same level as religion, because I had to admit to myself that even though I love science and I'm curious about it, and it seems like science is much more reasonable than religion, if I'm really totally honest, I have to admit that I don't know. I don't know if what religion says is false. I can't just dismiss it, even though it sounds kind of cuckoo. I can't dismiss it because I just don't know. And yet still, I leaned atheist at that point. I was pretty hardcore atheist at that point, because it just didn't make sense to me that God could be true. It seemed like a space kangaroo. It seemed totally outlandish. But deep down, I knew that I had to be very objective about this. So I couldn't call myself a scientist by that point, and I couldn't call myself a religious person. I was very averse to religion. And so, skepticism. This very inquiry that we're doing here is skepticism. That's what it is. So I became an arch radical skeptic. I questioned absolutely everything. My mom would make fun of me, and she would call me like the unbeliever, the infidel, the one who doesn't believe anything, because I would question everything. I would even question things like, is 0 times 2 equal to 0? I would question that. I would question that. Like, I would question 1 + 1 = 2. Everything. Like, I wouldn't believe it. In fact, it almost became pathological, because what started happening is that I started questioning even the most obvious and true things, like just common sense things. I would start to question to the point where it actually became kind of corrosive and toxic, because it actually became difficult to function, because certain things that other normal people would just take for granted as obvious, I couldn't I couldn't follow them into that. And I at that point I was very averse to faith. And so skepticism is sort of like the antithesis of faith. And so to me, faith wasn't just believing in God. To me, I saw faith everywhere. I saw people in science taking science on faith. I saw mathematicians doing mathematics on faith. I saw people doing logic, using logic on faith. faithfully assuming that logic would lead them to truth. And I couldn't do that. So I was very, very skeptical, and I actually created kind of a skeptic identity. And I enjoyed that. It was fun to play that. But then I started to question even deeper. And that's when a really twisted thing happened, which is that my skepticism went full circle, and it hit a sort of inflection point. And the way this happened is that one day I was sitting around and thinking about, I guess, how good it is to be a skeptic, to question everything. But then the thought came to me, wait a minute, what if all this skepticism is nonsense? And it's leading me away from the truth. This is what happens when you turn skepticism in on itself. You become so skeptical that, of course, you realize that to be truly skeptical, you must then apply your skepticism to your skepticism and doubt your own skepticism. Because there is a possibility, and it's not an unreasonable possibility, that this attitude of approaching life by questioning everything to death and doubting everything, that this very attitude and worldview is itself a delusion. After all, how do we know that skepticism leads to truth? We don't. And when you realize that skepticism eats its own tail. Because to truly be a full skeptic, you have to become so skeptical that you realize skepticism is untenable. And then where does that leave you? It leaves you in a sort of no man's land. You can't really call yourself a skeptic anymore, because if you're fully skeptical, then you have to admit that skepticism is untenable. So then, are you a skeptic? Are you a true skeptic? Or now have you gone beyond skepticism? Have you transcended skepticism? And then where does that leave you? Does that put you right back where you began? Or does that take you to some even deeper or higher place? Answer that for yourself. Do it. Do it. Become skeptical about your own skepticism. But before you do that, first become skeptical. First, spend a few years being deeply skeptical. Then spend a few years questioning your own skepticism and see where that leads you to. See? As you're doing all this, what you should start to notice is that there's something lurking in the background of your inquiry. Something you can't quite put your finger on. You don't know how to describe it or what it really is. But there's something there. And you're sort of circling around it, but you can't make it explicit. And you sense it in your reasoning process, because you are using reasoning and sort of common sense to think through these questions, to contemplate. You are contemplating here. You know, you're posing thought experiments, and maybe you're cherry picking examples from life or from history or from religion or from science. You're cherry picking stuff. So you're processing all this mentally. But as you're doing that, you realize that in this very process, there's some sort of nugget or kernel of truth that's there, that's guiding this process, if you're doing it carefully. It's not just pure fantasy. There's something there, but you don't know what it is. So, for example, when you're skeptical about everything, there's a certain logic behind your skepticism. There's a certain reason to it. It makes a certain kind of sense. And then when you realize that, wait a minute, maybe my skepticism is just more delusion, and it won't lead me to truth, there's also a certain kind of sense and logic to that. And then where it ends you in a sort of no man's land where you can't quite say you're a skeptic, and also you can't quite say you're not a skeptic. Because, you know, by realizing that skepticism is untenable, that doesn't just make you a blind believer in every random thing. So the opposite of skepticism is not just faith in everything. That makes no sense. The opposite of the transcendence of skepticism is a sort of no man's land. But also, when you reach this no man's land, something interesting happens to you. It affects your attitude towards the world. This no man's land. There's something about it. There's something truthful about it almost. Like there's something truthful about saying you don't know when you really don't know. And there's something untruthful with claiming that you know something that you feel deep down inside you don't really know. Like when religious people claim that God exists, but you ask them like, well, have you met God? And they say, well, no, of course I haven't met God, but I know he exists. But do you really know he exists? If you're very honest and you introspect, you have to be very honest now, and you have to you have to be able to transcend your cultural programming and biases. You have to admit that actually you don't know if God exists unless you've actually met him. See? Likewise, if you're an atheist, you say, well, God doesn't exist. But do you really know that? Well, if you introspect deeply and you're very honest with yourself, you're going to have to admit as an atheist, no, I don't actually know that. It seems likely that he doesn't exist because I've never seen him, but just because I haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So obviously, that's not good enough to rule out God. See? And when you make that admission to yourself, you feel better, you feel purer, you feel cleaner, you feel more honest and truthful. So see, in a sense, what you're doing with this inquiry is you're literally pulling yourself up by the hair, by the bootstraps in this process. You're sort of going around in circles with your mind, but as you do that, there's always a little bit of truth lingering in there somewhere. It's almost like, I've heard this good description of you're looking down a corridor, a long corridor, and then as you turn your head to look down the corridor, you see the tail of some mysterious wild animal quickly go around the corner. And as you're turning your head to look at it, you catch just the last couple of inches of the tail, and it goes by so fast with that sort of motion blur effect that you don't know what that was. It almost has the feel of a mirage, or you can't put your finger on it. It was too quick and too blurry, but you know you saw something there, but you have no idea what it was. And the more you do this process of inquiry, the more deeper you get into it, the more you self-reflect, the more honest you become, the more of these glimpses of the tail you catch. At first, you catch that glimpse of a tail once a month or once a year. It's extremely rare. You don't even think you'll see it again. But then the more you keep at this process, the more you see it. And it like every time it's like, what is that thing? There's something over there. And then as you walk to it down the corridor, you see that this is an infinite corridor. It goes forever. And so the closer you walk to the tail is always the same distance far away from you. This sort of weird, spooky thing. I'm being poetic here. There's no literal tail that you see. I'm being poetic. But something like this. So what starts to happen is that in this process of logicking and thinking this stuff through, you notice that there is, at the forefront, there is your logical mind thinking these questions through, struggling with them, maybe coming up with tentative conclusions, then discarding them, looking for other ones. So there's that happening at the forefront of your logical conscious mind. And then in the background, there is what I call an intuitive faculty. There is sort of an intuition, a deep intuition, which is observing the foreground activity of your mental state. And it's that deep intuition which is sort of connecting all the dots and drawing a big picture of what's really going on with you in this process. And it's from that intuition that you start to see certain connections, and you start to see that example of what I was calling the tail rounding the corner, catching a glimpse. Your intuition starts to catch these glimpses. But of course, there's still the lingering doubt in the back of your mind. Can you trust your intuition? What's more reliable? The foreground logical, rational activity of your mind, or that deep background of the intuitive, seeing the big picture, connecting the dots sort of deal, catching a glimpse of this tail rounding the corner? What's more true? Of course, at this early stage of the process, you don't know. So you just work with it. You see where it takes you. Supposedly, there is some concrete, definite way that the universe actually is, that reality actually is. And if there is that way, notice we have to distinguish here between how it actually is and how I think it is, how I believe it is, how I want it to be, how I imagine it to be, how I theorize about it, how I create mental imagery about it. Distinguish all those from the thing itself, from reality itself. See? So if I'm sitting here right now and I start to think like, well, maybe reality is like a giant sphere. That's the whole universe, is a giant sphere, and it's made out of energy, and it's got quarks bouncing around, trillions and trillions of quarks. That's from the Big Bang. So it exploded like a Big Bang, and then this happened, and then there was an inflation period, and this whole thing is expanding, and then eventually maybe what will happen is it'll get so big, the bubble will start to contract and then come back together, and all of it come back into a little tiny kernel, a little seed, a little mustard seed of all the quarks in the universe comes back, and it all compresses, and then it blows up again, and then this is what it is. That's the truth. But notice that's not the truth. That's your ideas of the truth. So if these ideas are actually pointing to something valid, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, we don't know, we have to test it, right? We have to test it. But let's say these ideas I have, and I just explained, they are actually what's going to happen and how it works. That still isn't actually it. You see, these are simplified ideas, abstractions, theories, models, gross oversimplifications, which means that isn't really it. What we're after is it itself. What is it? How do you get to it? Is there even an it? If there is an it, it's the truth. If there isn't an it, it's the truth. That there is no it would then be the truth. But if there is no it, then what is all this? What is this experience, this perception, could this be it? Could I be it? What is my relationship to it? Is there an it and a me? Which came first? Did it come first or did I come first? Or did we come together? Maybe there isn't an I, maybe there's only an it. Maybe there isn't an it, maybe there's only an I. Maybe the it and the I are one and the same, and maybe they're different. If you're wondering, well, Leo, the word truth, what does that even mean? Aren't we just playing word games here? Maybe we are. Maybe that's all we're doing. Maybe all this is just word games and a waste of time. But then again, is what's happening right now a word game? You have to be very careful in this process not to get lost in your own intellectualizations. and your own mind. When we're talking about discovering the truth, we're not talking about ideas or theories or philosophies. We're talking about the most true thing that there possibly can be. We're talking about reality itself. How reality actually is. So if you think that's all a word game, be careful. Because when you say that, what you're saying is that this very moment, your entire life is nothing but a word game. Is that really a road you want to go down? Is that really what you believe? See, because a lot of people will say, oh, philosophy and all this stuff Leo's talking about, it's all just a word game. But then they go right back to their ordinary life doing ordinary things. And they don't consider their children a word game. When your child gets cancer, is that just a word game? But you said it was. But do you react to the news of your child's cancer as though it were a word game? No, you don't. So that tells you there's a rift between what you believe or your worldview and how you actually interact with the world. See? So part of our work here is not only to convince us of some sort of philosophical theory and then go back to ordinary life and do all the stupid things we've always done. Part of our work here is to discover the truth, and whatever that truth is, then to align ourselves with the truth. See? So, like, for example, if you really believe that God exists, as a Christian sort of philosophy, and you really believe that God is a vengeful God and he writes down notes about who's been naughty and nice, and he will punish those who don't pray to him and do evil things and who act like jerks, and he will reward those who spread his word. If that's what you really believe, and you think that's truth, but then you don't act in accordance with it, then what you really believe at an even deeper level is that it's not truth. See, if you don't go to church, if you swear and break the 10 Commandments and you have abortions and do all the stuff that supposedly God doesn't want you to do, then it's actually your actions which reveal what you really believe. And the rest is just some fluff on top, some ideology you've constructed. See, what we're interested in this work is we're interested in being brutally honest with ourselves, and we're interested in getting past the fluff, past the ideals and all the stuff we tell our friends that we believe and that we think is right, into what actually shapes our actions, what motivates our emotions and our feelings. So, for example, if you like to tell your friends that, oh, well, reality is just a simulation, but then when your child gets cancer, you get all freaked out and you run to your friends for help and you tell them how terrible it is and how much you're suffering. Well, what that tells us is that you don't really believe it's a simulation. Because if you really believed it's a simulation, you wouldn't be so attached to this simulation. Because the cancer then is a simulation. Your child is a simulation, so why are you so attached to it? See? So this person, in this case, has an ideology that, oh, life's just a simulation, but then in practice, deep down, what he really holds as truth is that life is real, and that his child is precious and important, and that cancer is evil. That's his true philosophy, hiding under the fake one. So be very careful. The human mind is very tricky. It likes to create all sorts of fake, flowery philosophies, but then the way that we actually lead our lives, that's what reveals the real philosophy running the show. And usually that one is quite ugly and petty and nasty. For many people, the true philosophy running their show is something like that life is a dog-eat-dog world. It's brutish, it's brutal, it's short, it's indifferent. God doesn't give a fuck about you. There is no God. Evil devils are running amok. The world sucks. Life is fucking miserable. For many people, that's their true philosophy. Everything is pointless. Everything is depressing. So you got to be real honest with yourself here. This is a painful degree of self-honesty. It's a self-honesty that burns. Throughout this whole process, you have to hold your own feet to the fire and burn off your old ideas and ideologies. All of your pet theories have to be burned off. This process is ruthless. It's unpleasant. It's emotionally disturbing. It can lead to depression. It can lead to nihilism. It can make you act weird socially. It can make you reclusive. It can make you feel like you're losing your mind because you're truly doing the work. Later, when you finally complete all this work and you finally do reach the truth, you will appreciate why so few people reach the truth. It's because of the emotional labor and toil, emotional toil you had to go through to burn off all this fluff, all this programming that you've been conditioned with, and to rack your mind for years, for thousands of hours, trying to understand this stuff. But you'll also understand that there's no way it could be otherwise. You had to go through this process. You can't short-circuit this process by turning to some expert to tell you the answer. Now, in my own work here with Actualized.org, I tell you all the answers. So in a certain sense, of course, I contradict myself. But that's because I want to make a catalog of all the answers. That's my own agenda here. And the answers, in a sense, are easier to deliver than to guide you through this very subtle process of inquiry. So really what's happened here, we've just begun our inquiry into the foundations of human knowledge, otherwise known as epistemology. Personally, I think that this is one of the most important and underappreciated topics for mankind. On this hinges everything. This process is not taught in school. It's not taught in universities. It's certainly not taught in religions. It's not even taught in spiritual teachings. It's not taught in books. It's not taught in videos. It's very challenging to teach this. Very few people teach it because very few people have actually done it. Even many people who have awoken or who have had success on the spiritual path, they still have not really done this process deeply enough. You can have mystical experiences and even fairly significant awakenings without having gone through this whole process. And that's not a good thing. That's actually a bad thing. Because what it means is that you're going to have your awakening, but it's going to be muddled by a bunch of ideology and cultural conditioning and stuff you haven't truly questioned. And that will corrupt your awakening. So this is a little introduction into epistemology. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned some lessons here. I hope you actually went with me here on this journey and weren't just listening passively, but were working actively, pausing between different questions, trying to work this stuff out for yourself. This process is just like working a mathematical proof. You need to go through the steps of the proof and have traction in your mind with the logic of it to see the steps, how they interconnect, to see the end result. Of course, most people are so lazy they don't want to do any mathematical proofs. But hopefully you're one of the ones who isn't lazy, and you really have a passion for truth, and you want to get to the bottom of it, and you have some. I guess this process requires some faith. You need to have an overarching faith that this process will be worthwhile in some capacity. You need to at least have the faith that even if you go through this whole process and you never discover the truth, because maybe it doesn't exist, or maybe you'll just never find it, because it requires so much work. But you still need to have the sort of faith that even if you don't complete this process, it'll still be beneficial to you. Because if you don't have faith in that, then you're never going to invest the thousands of hours that are necessary to do this work. You just won't. You need to have some sort of vision. Now, of course, you might say, well, Leo, but why should I have this faith? After all, I don't know if it's going to be worthwhile. That's right. That's why they call it a leap of faith. You don't know, it's a risk. But hey, you know what? All of life is a risk. And by not doing this process, that's also a risk. Don't forget that. By not questioning yourself, by not questioning your culture, by not questioning your religion, by not questioning science, by not questioning your authority figures and teachers and gurus, that's an enormous risk. And this risk is not speculative. This risk has been borne out throughout all of human history. Think of all the mass racism and war and genocide and evil cults that have existed, Spanish Inquisitions, witch burnings, McCarthyism, Nazism, and all sorts of ideologies and mass conformist culture movements like this that have all, what's the one common element behind all of those? People weren't thinking independently for themselves. They were just being sheep. See? So don't think that you're somehow safe by avoiding this process. Then you just consign yourself to be a sheep. How do you think that's going to work out for you? Probably not so good. So there's trade-offs, there's pros and cons, there's a cost, there's a benefit to either decision. You'll do this inquiry or you won't. Or you'll do it for a little while, then you'll quit, then you'll come back when you're more mature and you're more developed. See, if you're still at the point where you're like, oh, Leo, but I don't know what's the point of the truth, I don't really care about it, then you're not developed enough, you're not mature enough, you're not wise enough to see why someone would want to know what existence is. After all, think of it this way. The only thing you have is existence. You know nothing but existence. Name one thing you know which is not existence or a part of existence. Even if you name something like a unicorn is a part of existence. In your mind, at least. Doesn't mean that you'll find a unicorn on Mars. It just means that in your mind, a unicorn is still something. Even figments of one's imaginations must exist. So, existence is all there is, at least from your perspective. Maybe there's something more, but so far, you've only experienced existence. So, if existence is all there is, don't you want to know what it is? Why it's here? Or are you just going to live your life like a chimp? You're just going to go on fucking and eating and shitting and working a dead-end job and then retiring and then dying. That's what your life is going to be. You're going to live for 80 or 100 years and you're never going to wonder what existence is. So you're going to care about raising a family, and you're going to care about making some money, and you're going to care about getting some sexual pleasure, and you're going to care about going on a vacation. You're going to care about all those little minutia, all that. This is peanuts within existence. Because you see, when you care about sex, or when you care about religion, or when you care about money, those are instances of existence. So you are caring about existence, but in an extremely narrow form. Now, what if you broadened your interest out away from those minutia peanut stuff to the entire nut? What is the whole thing in a nutshell? The universe in a nutshell, as Stephen Hawking would write. You're not going to care about that? Doesn't matter to you? You're going to exist, but you're not going to care or know what existence is? Doesn't that strike you as a little bit negligent? Especially if people tell you that it seems like it's possible to figure it out. People like myself who said to you that they figured it out and who seem to imply that there's some value to it. You're just going to ignore all that and you're going to go chasing sex and pleasure and food. Go shitting. What else do you have to do in life but to figure out what life is? Is there any better use of your time? See, it might seem like all this is just so abstract. It's so far away from my everyday concerns. Leo, how is this going to help me? I just want to escape my depression. I just want to stop feeling anxious. I just want to feel good. But what if all of that is in some roundabout way connected to your ignorance about existence? What if your inability to choose a career or to choose a relationship or to be indecisive as you are, to be lost and lazy and depressed and to feel that life is pointless and to make all these mistakes that you make in your life, to waste your money on this thing, to have sex with the wrong guy or with the wrong girl, to marry the wrong person, to have fights with people, all this shit that you're dealing with on a daily basis. What if all of this had something to do with existence itself? After all, those are instances of existence. Don't you think it might help to know what existence is? Maybe, maybe not. You don't know. How can you know? The only way you'll know is if you do it. So I've planted some seeds in you here. I've guided you on the beginning of this journey, just the tip of the iceberg. It's up to you now to continue this work, this epistemological existential inquiry. I recommend you keep questioning what truth is. Keep going down the same kind of lines of logic that I've been taking you down in this episode and see where it takes you. Be patient with it. Have a long time horizon. Take it up as a hobby. And maybe one day you'll find it to be worthwhile. All right, that's it for this one. Please click that like button for me and come check out Actualized.org. That's where you'll find some additional exclusive resources like my blog, where I post insights and videos that aren't found anywhere else. And my book list, where I have a lot of books that discuss this whole topic of truth and very spiritual topics and so forth that they will help you in this quest towards the truth. But I recommend you don't overuse them. Make sure you do plenty of your own investigation, because remember, books are just hearsay in the end. You'll find the Life Purpose course if you want to help with finding a sense of direction in your life and building a career around that. The Life Purpose course details principles that I use to develop my own sense of purpose and to be a leader and to develop my business and the work that I do and to be an artist. All of the principles I learned in doing that for myself, I spent about 10 years trying to figure that out. I figured it out for myself. Now I'm doing it, and then I put it into a course, so you can check that out. People seem to like it. And then what else do I got? I'm forgetting something. Oh yeah, the forum. Check out the Actualized forum. And lastly, of course, check out Patreon. I recently launched on Patreon. If you like my work, if you want to support it, this work doesn't get that many views because these videos are long. They're esoteric. They're kind of deep. So that money I will be using in the future towards marketing and expanding Actualized and trying to bring more content and also bringing the existing content to more people. So if you chip in $5 a month, that's very helpful. And I'm very grateful for those donations that you guys have been giving me. That's awesome. It's inspiring. Helps me to do this work. Because for this work, I have to maintain my independence above anything else. This is real philosophy here. See, the philosophy they teach you in university, that's bullshit philosophy. This is real philosophy. Real philosophy, when it's done right, is life-transforming stuff. It's not sitting around navel-gazing and speculating about things. It's not coming up with ideologies. It's the opposite of all that. It's really questioning. It's really introspecting. It's learning various principles of how the mind works. As you do this work, if you do this inquiry work, one of the main benefits you'll get is you will learn the trickeries of your own mind. In a way that you can't possibly by reading some book. You have to actually be tricked by your own mind and then unravel the tricks of your own mind to learn how the mind works. This is something I've been studying for probably 20 years now, is how my own mind tricks me. And that still doesn't make me immune to the tricks because the mind is extremely tricky. But also, what's amazing about this work when you do it long enough and deep enough is that you get to a point where almost no other human can trick you. Because you're so good at understanding your own tricks. And of course, your own tricks are the same as the tricks that other people play on you and play on themselves, is that you almost develop this superpower to see through people and to see through situations. You can look at a situation, whether it's a political one on the news, or you can read a book, or you can look at a teacher or a lecture or a video on YouTube or somebody telling you something about life or about reality or about themselves, and you can just, it's like you have X-ray vision. You see through the bullshit. You immediately know they're full of shit. You know how they're tricking you, or trying to at least, and you know how they're tricking themselves. Whether it's religious people, scientific people, or cult leaders, or whatever, this gives you a sort of X-ray superpower. It's quite useful, actually, in a very practical sense. Like, for example, you're doing business, you can tell when someone's trying to screw you in a business deal. You can tell the tricks they use because you are so good at spotting those tricks within yourself. Of course, this also clears up your own perception of reality, such that even if we're not talking about some sort of lofty metaphysical topics, we're just, let's say, talking about business deals. In a business deal, you can tell when you develop that introspective capacity, you can tell when you're bullshitting yourself in a business deal. See, because it's not only that someone bullshits you in a business deal, you also bullshit yourself. You tell yourself things like, oh, well, yeah, this is a really good deal. That guy's giving me such a good break. I would be stupid not to take this deal. You know, your mind will tell you these things. So this helps all around, because guess what? All of existence is being filtered through your mind to get to you. And whatever kind of distortive lenses your mind has, whatever operation it's doing before it gets to you, if you're not aware of it, that's something that's a corrupting influence in your life. Here's another final thought I'll leave you with about the value of truth. If truth is reality, If truth is finding out how reality actually is, that which is the case, the truth is that which is the case, what else is there? That which is not the case, that which is false, that which is a fantasy. But by definition, that which is not the case doesn't exist. So, if you think about it, the only thing there is the truth. And there's nothing else but the truth. So think of it this way. If you don't find the truth, what do you have? You have that which is not the case. You have nothing. How are you going to live your life when you're not clear about the only thing that there is? And all you have is that which isn't. Do you think that would create some dysfunctions and problems in your life if you lived that way? Anyways, that's some food for thought. I only started you on this journey here. I didn't give you any answers deliberately. It's not about giving you answers. You got to find it for yourself. And of course, if you want the answers, I've got plenty of other videos which do give those to you.